Welcome to the In Touch podcast with Charles Stanley for Friday, February 19th. Today's program moves along in the series on dealing with life's pressures, this time opening the scriptures to find salve to ease the wounds left by rejection.
Do you ever feel unwanted, shut out, isolated? Do you find yourself searching out for ways to make other people like you and to approve of you? Or do you find yourself being barraged by the question, I wonder what people think of me? And do you find yourself having difficulty in relating to people? Well, if all of those things are true, it just may be that you are being hampered and hindered in your Christian life by a form of bondage that is painful, oftentimes unidentifiable, and oftentimes extremely hurtful. In fact, a form of bondage that will cause you to project on other people feelings about yourself that they don't feel at all, or to believe the devil's lies. A form of bondage that will control your attitude, what you think, how you feel, your actions. And a form of bondage that will always make you a little bit uncertain about your relationship to God. Well, what kind of bondage are we talking about? We're talking about the bondage of self-rejection. And that's the theme of this message. And I want you to turn, if you will, to two verses in Colossians chapter 1. In Colossians chapter 1, here is the key to overcoming self-rejection. You say, well, what do you mean? What's the difference between self-rejection and rejection? Well, I want to talk about that in a moment. But I want us to read these two verses in Colossians 1. Verse 21 says, And although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he has now reconciled you in his fleshly body through death in order to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach. Now, when we think about rejection, the truth is we can't always control whether someone rejects us or not, but what we can control is how we respond to that rejection. And people who suffer from self-rejection suffer a very painful form of bondage. So first of all, let's clear up what do we mean by rejection, and I want us to have a clear understanding of that. To reject someone is to refuse to accept a person. If you are rejected, someone has refused to accept you the way you are. And if we reject conduct on somebody else's part, we refuse to accept that conduct from our standards. Now, there's a distinction here that I think we ought to understand. That is, you can reject a person's conduct and behavior without rejecting their personhood. And where we get confused is sometimes a person rejects what we do and we take it as rejecting us as a person. Sometimes parents, the way they correct their children, they correct them in a fashion that their children hear, I'm not worthy, I don't count, you don't like me, I don't fit, you want me out of here, rather than correcting their behavior. So there is a distinction here. When we talk about self-rejection, we're talking about the inability to accept ourselves. And the result is that that conveys feelings to us of being unworthy, unfit, and that we're not acceptable on the basis of what we think we ought to be accepted on. And so there are these feelings that we begin to feel on the inside that become very painful. And the truth is, again, that rejection is a form of communication. We communicate to people when we reject them. We communicate that we disapprove of them, that they're unfit, that they're unworthy, and that we don't want them, and they're out of place. So rejection is a very, very strong form of communication. And it's amazing how we can communicate to people what we feel in a way that is oftentimes very, very hurtful to them. A person can feel rejected without ever being rejected. A person can be rejected and feel rejected. A person can be rejected and not feel rejected. But the basic fallacy in it all is this, and that is that I am willing to base my self-worth on the opinions of others rather than on my relationship to God. And whenever I base my sense of self-worth on what other people think rather than the basis of what God says about me, I'm going to feel self-rejection. Likewise, the dominating thought in the person who feels self-rejection is this. That is, I must please these particular people or this particular person in order to feel good about myself. So when a person has these two ideas roaming around in their thinking and their emotions all the time, and that is, my basic sense of self-worth is based on other people's opinion rather than my relationship to God, and I must have these people's approval in order to feel good about myself, I am already caught and trapped in a form of bondage from which I desperately need release. And so when we think in terms of self-rejection, I want us to think in terms of those ideas. Now, what I'd like to do is to give you a list of characteristics of people who feel self-rejection. One of them would naturally be, in the light of what rejection is all about, one of them would naturally be an overemphasis on dress. You see, everything has to be exactly right. And that's why a person spends lots of time in front of the mirror being sure that everything is right. And then before they walk out the door, they go back and look 3 more times in the mirror to be sure the shoes or the hat or the hair or the face or the dress or the suit or whatever it might be is exactly right. Why? Because they fear rejection. A second characteristic is a person who is feeling self-rejection, cannot accept themselves, cannot live up to their own expectations, feels unacceptable before God and before others, oftentimes has a very difficult time in their trusting God. Because here's the way they think. They say, well, you know, I certainly don't seem to be able to please other people. I'm not acceptable to them, and they're not perfect. How in the world could I be acceptable to God, and how could I please God if I can't please others? A third reason, or a third characteristic, is the fear of other people's opinions. So many people fear what other people think. Well, what is so-and-so going to think? Well, how are they going to respond? And suppose I do this. And sometimes they make their decisions based on the fear of what other people are going to think rather than on seeking clear-cut direction and prayer from God. And therefore, they cause more problems in their life. A person who has a problem with self-rejection has a very difficult time loving someone else or being loved by other people. Why? Well, think about it for a moment. If a person does not feel acceptable to others, and a person doesn't feel like that they measure up, then they do not feel love. They can't feel love because they don't measure up to what they believe the other person expects. And like us, when it comes to loving someone else, it's very difficult for them to do that because they've already been hurt time after time, and what they say is, you know, I can't stand any more hurt. And therefore, because I can't stand any more hurt, I cannot allow myself to be vulnerable and step out on a limb and begin loving someone else. And sometimes they have been hurt. And sometimes that hurt within them is because they have been rejected in some area of their life, maybe as a child. And so it makes it very difficult. When a child comes up in a home feeling rejected by parents, it is difficult for that person, man or woman, to give themselves totally to the other marriage partner for fear of being rejected in some fashion or the other. And that will affect every single facet of that marriage life, no matter what it is. And then a critical spirit. A person who is going through some feelings of rejection naturally is critical because they feel that other people are critical of them. And as we said before, they sense that other people are projecting on them feelings about themselves the person hasn't even thought about. And so because they feel criticized, they naturally in turn, to defend themselves, will criticize other people. And what they do is they usually criticize other people in the areas in which they feel inadequate themselves and criticized by others, which creates a very negative atmosphere in their life, and they sort of walk in this negative spirit. Well, I'm not everything I ought to be, but so is no one else. That's sort of the attitude that they have. Feelings of inferiority. Naturally, a person who feels rejected would feel that because if you don't feel like you measure up to those that you want approval from, and especially if you try real hard and you don't get their approval. Here's a kid growing up, and no matter if he makes B's, he should have made A's. And if he made A's, he should have made A pluses. And if he made A pluses, he should have been on the football team, or she should have been on the basketball team. Enough is never enough. And so what happens? They feel inferior, inadequate, can't live up to. And how many times I've talked to men and women who've said, somehow no matter what I did, I could never please my daddy. I wanted my daddy to love me, and I loved my dad, and I'm sure he must have loved me, but somehow I could never please him. And I want to say to you dads, if your children think that they never please you, they will grow up thinking they can never please God. You are the male image in their life and the authority in their life, and if they can't please you, how are they going to please God who's perfect? And so they grow up with these feelings of inferiority, unacceptable, can't live up to, unloved, because there's something bound to be wrong on the inside of me or outside of me. Then, of course, there's the whole idea of anger. When a person is suffering self-rejection, naturally they're angry. Why? Simply this. A person who feels that they're not acceptable don't want to feel that way. And when they try to get you to accept them and they feel that you don't accept them, and they get frustrated, and frustration is a form of anger, and so what happens? They become hostile and angry and sometimes bitter because, they say, well, I've done my best and I've done everything I know to do and I still can't get your acceptance. And it may be that you're not rejecting them, but it's feelings they have. And those feelings develop naturally into anger. Perfectionism is another characteristic of a person who is going through self-rejection. Perfectionism says, I must do it exactly right in order to feel good about myself. And perfectionism can be costly. In other words, this dress or this suit or this pair of shoes or this house or this automobile or this, that, or the other is not good enough until it is exactly right, because it must be perfect in order for me to feel good about myself. Well, that is a terrible trap. It is a trap. It is a form of bondage, because how much is enough and what is exactly right? And if it takes this today, what will it take tomorrow? And so a person who lives with someone who is in a state of rejection and who is constantly rejecting them somehow can never do enough. If you live with someone who is in a rejection syndrome, it doesn't make any difference what happens. They feel that you reject them. They can prove that you reject them. They felt rejection all of their life. If you live with a person like that, somehow you'll never be able to please them until God brings them out of it. Sometimes the idea of rejection comes across as superior. And so the feeling of superiority, the attitude, what that person conveys, that sort of hidden insecurity is what it is. And so they come on as strong and superior and better than and egotistical and sometimes full of pridefulness. What they're doing is covering up for their insecurity. And when you come on to someone who's a loud talker and always everything is absolutely fantastic and wonderful, and they did this yesterday and they're going to do that tomorrow and everything was wonderful 2 weeks ago, and what they're doing, that's just a big cover-up. Now, I'm not saying that some people's personality isn't that type or similar to that, but oftentimes a person who feels rejection, in order to cover it up and to camouflage it, their inferior feelings, they just come on real strong, and what they're really doing is trying to cover up their real feelings. Person who feels rejection is easily hurt. A person who is in feelings of self-rejection, just can't measure up and can't please myself, can't please God, can't please others, try to get their approval, can't seem to get it, no matter what we do. Here's what they do. Because of these deep feelings of hurt that they've had, and because they're easily hurt, you don't have to say much to a person who is suffering self-rejection for them to be hurt. In fact, it's like they have all their antennas out, just waiting to be hurt. You say, well, now, wait a minute. If a person feels that and feels the pain, why in the world would they have their antennas out to be hurt? I'm going to show you in a moment. So here's what happens. A person who is experiencing self-rejection, let's say, for example, it's your friend. And so you do something real nice for them, and you try to love that person and express genuine concern and deep love, or maybe it's your marriage partner or your son or your daughter, your parents, and no matter what you do, somehow the more you love them, the more uncomfortable they become. And so what happens is this. In a marriage relationship or family relationship, a person who suffers and is trapped by self-rejection, the better you are, the more uncomfortable they become. And so finally, here's what they will do. Over and over and over again, they will do something in some fashion, Sometimes you think, where in the world did that come from? They will do something to get you upset if they can, or to get you to disagree with them, and finally get you angry if at all possible, and get you mad, and get you to say something that may be harsh or cruel or crude or difficult or hurtful. They'll get you to do anything to make them feel rejected. And as soon as you do it, they say, well, praise the Lord. Now, I knew I was right. See, I knew I was unworthy. I knew I didn't fit. I knew you didn't like me. I knew I didn't measure up. Now, they probably don't say praise the Lord. They don't think in terms of that. But in their insides, in their emotional feeling, what happens is when you take out vengeance on that person, or when you express anger toward them because of their way they've responded to your love, they feel good. Why? Because the atmosphere in which they live is rejection. Therefore, when you concede to that rejection and you reject them, then they feel at home. My friend, that goes on day after day after day. It goes on in business, in the families. It goes on in relationships. Because hurt feelings with a person who feels rejected is disastrous to them. They can't handle it. They don't know how to handle it. And that's what we're all about, and that is helping folks know how to handle it. Likewise, a person who is undergoing or experiencing self-rejection is a little bit suspicious of everything that you do for them. It doesn't make any difference whether it's something small or something great. Deep down inside, they think, well, now, wait a minute, you must want something. Because you see, first of all, remember, they feel unacceptable. They don't measure up, so why in the world would you be doing something nice and kind for them when they know that they don't deserve it? And the reason they keep these walls built up is because they don't want you to look over the wall. If you looked over the wall, you'd see them the way they see themselves, and if you did, you certainly wouldn't like them. And so we have to accept the fact that, yes, we will be rejected, but we don't have to accept the feelings of rejection. So what if somebody else rejects you? Your sense of self-worth is not based on that individual's opinion. It's based on your relationship to God, because their opinion of you is going to change. And they'll like you today and hate you tomorrow, or wonder what's going on with you tomorrow. And then, of course, depression is another characteristic of a person who is in rejection. Why would they be depressed? Very simply, because they know they have failed to meet your expectation, and they have disappointed you, because they are inadequate and they just don't measure up, and they're worthless and they don't count, and you should have married somebody else, and you could have done better, and I'm going to run away from home, you should have had better kids than myself, and all of these things they go through. And when they get hurt, they get depressed. Then they think about, well, why am I living anyway? I'm just taking up space. I might as well just kill myself and just get rid of myself. My friend, don't ever take your life because you think somebody doesn't like you or love you. God loves you unconditionally. And no matter what kind of mess you've made in your life, no matter how rejected you may feel unloved, uncared for, and unknown by the whole world. The one who really knows you best is the one who loves you most. And the one who loves you most is the one who knows you perfectly. And no matter what you're going through, He loves you just the way you are. And He'll bring you through it if you let Him do it. Then there's a characteristic of self-verification. A person who is in rejection is always in life. No matter what's going on, what they're doing is they're trying to verify their worthiness. That is, on the one hand, they know that they feel unworthy. On the other hand, they think, well, surely I'm worth something. On the other hand, I'm not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. And so they're going through life trying to verify themselves. That is, verify their own sense of self-worth. Again, it's a trap. And God does not want us going through life trying to verify something that He's already verified in His Word when He said we are His children.
Thank you for listening to How to Handle Our Rejection. If you'd like to know more about Charles Stanley or In Touch Ministries, stop by intouch.org. This podcast is a presentation of In Touch Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.